Alrighty guys, another day, another strength, back with another episode of Mind Over Muscles. This one's very special, right? We're talking about the row and the chin-up. And this is very important because generally we have the big three or the big four movement patterns, but really these two I think should be in there as well. So I'm making it the big six right here, right? These are often overlooked. The why for doing these is that horizontal pulling and pushing, horizontal and vertical pulling are often overlooked natural human movement patterns, right? We have horizontal and vertical pressing or pushing. That's a big, foundational thing, especially for us gym bros, us dudes, just guys being dudes. But anyways, the horizontal and vertical pulling are also just as important. They are the main movement equivalent of the press and the bench press, obviously, right? So the chin up and the row. The chin up is unique in the same way the bench press is, in that the kinetic chain does not run from the feet to the hands. You get your hands, I guess it kind of does run through your feet, but you're hanging from the bar, which is different from having to balance the barbell. So I guess I should say that it's unique in that you don't really have to balance yourself the way you would with a traditional barbell lift. But yeah, very foundational movement patterns. They improve all of the big four or big three movements that you can think of. So those are all good reasons to do them. And the reason I'm including both in the same video, the chins and the rows, and not giving them each their own video, is because they're very similar and they're not very technical, right? And there's a lot of overlap between the two. So there are some differences, which I'll touch on as I go through, but they're really not that different, right? So as far as the prime movers in these movements, we have the upper back, right? So the lats, traps, and rear delts are like the big three of the upper back. That's how I think about them, basically. So those are generally being used isometrically, right? I almost forgot the word entirely. Isometrically in the deadlift and the squat as well, right? But this way, the lats, traps, and rear delts are used concentrically and eccentrically as prime movers. So if you don't do chins or rows and you're just doing the bench, the press, the squat, and the deadlift, you're not using the lats, traps, or rear delts as a prime mover in any lift, right? So this uses them as a prime mover, and also the biceps, right? If you're a dude, come on, right? Gotta get juicy biceps. So gotta include that one in there. We also have the long head of the triceps, which is involved a lot in the overhead press lockout position. That's because the long head of the tricep, it basically does the same thing as the lats, where it extends the shoulder. So you're bringing the shoulder this way, which you're doing in like a row or a chin, right? Think of that with the humerus. And then it also brings the arms, adducts them, so it takes them from here to there. So in the overhead press, right, you're coming up like this, so the humerus is getting pulled towards the body, so you're using the long head there. And then it also trains the rotator cuff as a prime mover in this as well, which is great. Because again, if you're doing the bench or the press, I guess like a little bit it gets used there as a prime mover, but deadlift is postural, squat is postural, right? And then as far as the postural muscles for the rows and the chins, more so the barbell row, depending on the type of row that you're doing, you're gonna be using a lot of the spinal erectors no matter what kind of row you're doing generally, unless you're doing like a seal row. The abs, and then the glutes and the hamstrings if you're doing like more of like a Yates row or like a stiff leg row. And then the forearms across any kind of row or chin up is gonna be postural as well. But yeah, the technique for these lifts is gonna be kind of goal dependent, as I said. So if you're trying to like row as much weight as possible, that's gonna be different from doing a barbell row to build a lot of muscle to assist with the main lifts, right? So as I always say, you're gonna build muscle with either type of row. You're gonna build strength with either type of row, but you're gonna build more strength with like more of a cheat row, and you're probably gonna build, a reasonable amount of muscle mass, but not quite the same as if you were to really focus on, taking those muscles through a long range of motion. But yeah, so generally these lifts are not trained at peak strength unless you're competing in a certain sport. So like the pull-up and chin-up in street lifting, that's used as main lift, right? So you do like a 1 rep max weighted pull-up or weighted chin-up. Generally, I can't really think of any sport or strength sport where you use the row in like a 1 rep max context, so you're generally not going to see that sort of thing going on. But yeah, they're generally not very technical. They're pretty intuitive. The thing with the chin up is that you're already hanging from the bar, so you're basically like the bar is pulling you into balance versus having to like find your balance over your 2 feet, right? And then the rows, you basically just keep the spine extended, move the bar in a straight line. So there is a balance component. You do want the bar over midfoot, but it's pretty intuitive if you're already doing the main lifts. It's not that hard to figure out, right? And then since you're not really training it in like the 1 to 3 top end strength rep range, the technique is gonna, you can get away with more because you're not gonna like fail all of a sudden because you're doing a super heavy load. But yeah, the grip, as far as like, with the technique that you're using, you can adjust the grip to bias the stress towards certain muscles. So for example, like the more narrow your grip, the more your elbows are probably gonna be in during the lockout. So think of like a pull-up, right? If you have a nice narrow grip like this and you get your elbows way in, that's going to bring your humerus like almost parallel to your torso, which is going to work a lot of the lats, right? Because like I said, the lats, they adduct the humerus, they bring it towards the body, right? So the more you're able to bring the humerus towards the body during the ascent, the more you're going to work the lats. So generally, a more narrow grip is going to be more lats and biceps as well, because you're working the elbow through a long range of motion by doing that, right? Versus if you're like way out here, the elbow's only going to bend like halfway versus the full way. So more biceps in that context. And then generally more wide, more elbows out, you're going to have more traps and rear delts, because the traps, generally, they retract the scapula. So you're going to have a lot more scapular retraction, and you're going to have a lot less of the lat because you're going to have less of the pulling the elbow towards the body. So yeah, it depends on your goal. So that's how you kind of like bias with the grip. But yeah, common errors with these lifts. One of them is the quote unquote cheating, similar to the bench press. So it depends on your standard for cheating, depends on what you're trying to do. So if you're like a CrossFitter and you're kipping during your pull-ups, you know, that's just part of the sport, so you can do that. But if you're trying to do pull-ups to build up your back muscles, then the kipping is probably not a great idea because you're leaving out parts of the range of motion where the stress needs to be on the muscles, right? And then as far as the row goes, there's like, if you're trying to, you know, do the same thing, like keep the stress on the target muscles, if you're using a lot of leg drive or like kind of like diving into the bar, where you kind of like leg drive it off the ground and then like duck your torso down to the bar really quick, that is going to take some of the stress off the target muscles. Another big technique error is general looseness. So that's the same thing as the other main lifts. Like I think people just in general, if they're not experienced with strength training, they kind of like go into it with like a haphazard mindset. They're not as tight as they should be. So as far as the chin-ups go, not gripping the bar tightly enough, right? So not really getting that grip set, not using chalk, that sort of thing. The forearms are transferring force really hard during these lifts. They're a very important postural muscle. And you're going to train your grip a lot by doing them. So you really want to lock the grip in tight, because that's going to be, you know, as soon as the bar starts to like slip into your fingers, that's where you're going to have issues. And as far as the rows, you can use straps for those. You can use straps for chins and pull-ups too if you want to. It just depends on your goal, but I like to, you know, keep the grip there, train the forearms as well. And then as far as the rows go, the biggest error is generally just having the back not be extended, same as the deadlift, right? It's really the same starting position as the deadlift with a lot of different rows, especially from the floor, a lot of the heavier ones. So you just want to make sure your back stays tight. And then the final error is the eccentric, right? So if the goal is muscle mass, like I was saying, that ties in with the cheating. You want to control the eccentric and not just like drop the bar on the floor. If you're doing a chin-up or pull-up, you want to not just like flop all the way back down to the hang position. But yeah, so that's basically the long and short of the technique. As far as the variations go, number one, like the best variations for either of these lifts is adjusting the grip, like I said. So like if you're rowing with a narrow grip, you know, move out to like a wider grip and do that as well. So if you're doing two types of rows, one can be more of a narrow grip, one can be more of a wider grip. If you're doing chins and pull-ups, you can literally just do that. Like do one supinated, do one pronated, and there you go. And just find the most mechanically efficient setup for each one. Generally with chins, I like the grip a little bit closer because you're using more of the bicep, and so that also like allows you to lean into that and use a lot of bicep and a lot of lats as well. Which I just find like, I've tried both for myself, and I find that if I have a wider grip, supinated, I can't do as many chins, versus if it's a nice narrow grip, I can do a lot. And then for the pull-ups, it's kind of the other way around where, you know, it's kind of like the bench and the press where I want to have a nice vertical forearm at the lockout position. So if I'm doing pull-ups, I go just a little bit wider, not like super, super wide, but like right about there, you know, where my forearms are going to be more or less vertical in the lockout position, and that gives me the strongest pull-up. But yeah, doing both of those is going to be good. And then you can also adjust the angle for either of these lifts. So some examples would be like if you're doing rows, you have a lot of options. You know, you could do like a totally bent over, like a Pendlay row. You could do a more of like a Yates row where, you know, Pendlay row, your torso is like this. A Yates row, it's more like that. You could even do a chest supported row where you're super horizontal and then you take the low back out of it. So you can kind of get like the best of both worlds there. With the vertical pulls, you have the pull-ups and chins where you're like this, and then you can kind of do like a lat pull down. It's popularized by Alex Leonidas. It's called the ghetto pull down, which I like a lot. You kind of lean back a good amount like that. So you might set your feet against the power rack. If it's like a power rack cable attachment, that's where it tends to work best. So we have one at Starting Strength Boston, which is great. But yeah, you can kind of lean back a ton and get almost like a diagonal pull. You can also do the same thing with a rack chin-up that's popularized by Dante Trudell from the, you know, the dog crap method. Go check that out. But yeah, he does these things called rack chins where you just like hang from a barbell, set your feet on a bench, and you can kind of let your lumbar spine go into flexion which gets a bigger stretch on the lats. And then the third variation, not really the third, but like the third category of variations is the bodybuilding. As with all the lifts, you have specific prime movers like the biceps, the long head of the triceps, the lats, rear delts, and traps. Some movements you can use for those because, like, you know, if you're doing these two lifts, those are already really good, you know, like bodybuilding style movements to work all those muscles. But like biceps, obviously curls, long head of the triceps, any kind of extension, especially overhead. As far as the lats go, you can do stuff like pullovers and straight arm push downs or pull downs. Rear delts, you've got like upright rows, you've got face pulls, which could be considered rows in their own right. And then you've got reverse flies, something like that, or like a Y raise, something. And then you also have the, for the traps, there's like shrugs. And then you've got the abs and the erectors as well as postural muscles that benefit from these movements, more so with the row than the chin up. But like any kind of ab movement, any kind of like back extension, or even like deadlifts are going to help your rows a lot, right? So they're not really specific at all. So generally, like the more muscle you have, the better these two pulls are going to be. And then as far as programming and progression, the 1 to 3 rep range, you're generally not going to use very much unless you're trying to compete in street lifting. And what I found from my own personal experience is that if you're doing singles for a barbell lift, for example, like the press or like the squat, there's a balance component that you have to practice with heavier weights because it doesn't feel the same as it does at a lighter weight. And then as far as the pull-up and chin-up, like the technique is really the same, whether it's a set of 5 or a single. Like that part doesn't change, the balance component is the same. It's really just acclimating to the heavier weight and getting used to it. So you don't need to do quite as many singles, in my personal opinion. I'm sure there might be like some street lifters out there that disagree. You can go ahead and check out how they train, but like, you know, it's just not a very technical movement. And then as far as the row goes, like I said, you're generally not doing a lot of like, there's not really like a strength sport where you do like a 1 rep max row. So that's like, if that's your endeavor, then go for it. But the main reason to go into these heavier rep ranges, if you don't have any goals for like top end strength on them, is just to kind of like break through a plateau, which can be useful. So like if you've been doing a lot of, let's say like 4 to 6 rep range, and you're kind of getting stuck and you're having trouble breaking through, like throw in a couple of heavy singles or like heavy sets of 2 or 3, and that may just be the jolt that you need to kind of like unstick yourself and get things moving again. And then as far as like the 10 plus range, you can do those with these main movements, and then you can also use them with the supplemental work, because these are in some ways supplemental to the main lifts. But yeah, and then one last note for implementing these with programming is supersets, right? So you can superset the bench press with the row, and you can superset the press with the chin up or pull up, right? And you're not going to have a lot of overlap between the muscles being worked, so you can actually not really have like a decrease in performance between those, and then it's going to allow you to not skip them, get through your workout in less time. And especially with these, if you do them after the press, generally, like I said, you know, you are prioritizing top end strength on either the press or the bench for either a strength sport or just because you like to do that. And then as far as the press, or sorry, as far as the chin and the row, you're not doing that. You're not prioritizing the top end strength. So it's not really a big deal if you're like a little bit fatigued from your press or your bench beforehand, right? And then by the time you get your rest afterwards, your press and bench are not going to get affected by the chin and the row. If anything, it even kind of helps in some ways because like with the row, you know, you get kind of like almost a back bump. Then you can kind of like feel your arch a little bit tighter. It almost helps out with the movement, in my opinion. But yeah, and then as far as like programming sets and reps, do those as needed. With chins, I kind of treat them like the press, so I might do like 4 or 5 sets. I might do a lot of like the 4 to 6 rep range, and then occasionally heavier than that as well, like I said. And then with the rows, I usually do maybe like 3 or 4 sets with those, and then I usually keep them in the 4 to 6 rep range, sometimes a little bit higher reps than that, but I generally don't go below 4 reps unless I'm trying to like bust through a plateau or something. But yeah, that's really it about these 2 lifts. They're really great. So the next video in this series is going to be about some of the smaller lifts, the more isolation movements, and kind of like why you would want to build muscle in the first place and the different reasons for why that is. And really the muscles that are either not worked with these main lifts or that need like a little extra love afterwards with them. So we'll get into that in the next episode of the series. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. Say something in the comments, and I'll see you guys in the next video. All right, goodbye.